up until March last year, Luke was the US Justice Department's most senior official focusing on cyber investigations and prosecutions. He has worked with many authorities in that role, including the Australian government, on ways of dismantling global cyber threats, and he represented the US in many cyber negotiations with a range of countries, including Russia. That clearly went well. Luke is currently the co-chair of global cyber practice at leading global law firm and, excuse me, Luke, if I mangle this pronunciation, Debevoise and Plimpton? Close enough. Luke will be joined for a Q&A by Richard Baker. Many of you would know Richard. He is one of this city's, if not Australia's, foremost investigative reporters. I started counting the number of awards you've won, Richard, and I gave up counting. He is well celebrated for his work, and he has a particular interest in cybersecurity and the effect that has on Australia as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause for one of America's most foremost cybersecurity experts, Luke Dembosky.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It is really an honor. I was telling some folks that I was a journalism major in college and started my career in journalism and public relations, and so I have a huge respect for what you're doing, and it's been a huge part of our public discourse related to cyber, to have active journalists in our country on these issues, and we certainly need that here and around the world. I'm going to be very quick on some slides because I know we really want to give a lot of time for your questions. You can ask anything you want. I may not be able to answer everything that you want, but I'll do my best. But I thought I'd give a little bit of a flavor, especially in the beginning, about where the threats have gone. I started in this business in 2002. I had been a litigation attorney in Philadelphia for a few years as a young associate at a firm. And then under grandparent pressure, we moved back to our home city, Pittsburgh, and I became a federal prosecutor, and they threw me in the cyber unit, which my wife, who's actually a technical science person, thought was hilarious because I was a liberal arts person. We still had a VCR, and I still struggled to program it. But even someone like me can learn this stuff over time, and I found myself doing 8 years of cases inherently around the world because of the nature of cyber, and then was either promoted or exiled, depending on your perspective, to our embassy in Moscow to interface with our colleagues in Russia on these and other trans-border crime issues. Early in 2013, was asked to head the criminal division of the Justice Department's cyber program, and this was a place that it's a very cerebral place called the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, and they've giant-brained policy wonky people there, and I was their new knuckle-dragging litigator type who was going to come in and sort of turn it up a notch on the prosecution side, and I did my best to, quote, go out and break some things. And we ended up with some pretty significant incidents we had to respond to, including the Target breach, breach of Home Depot, and a number of others. And then I was lured to the national security side after a year and a half to head the first national security cyber program at Justice. And I thought I was done with the Friday night breach call where you spend, night and day and give up your weekend on a big data breach, when Nicole Seligman, the president of Sony Pictures, called and said, I have a big problem. It's the North Koreans, it appears. We need to do something. And that kicked off several months of intense work with the White House, with other agencies, with Nicole and Sony. We saw a number of things develop that I'll show you in a second here. So now I co-chair for a year and a half the global cyber team at Debevoise and Plimpton. And we're finding that these problems that affect our clients are, just like the crimes I prosecuted, inherently international. And so my career, if it's been nothing else, has been about trying to build bridges with our colleagues in various countries, in government, law enforcement, private sector, because no one country, no one organization, no matter how large or powerful, can begin to handle these problems on the scale they are now. So a little bit about where we're going to go, although I think I will only get a little ways in. If you see me looking at my watch, it's not because I have somewhere to go, it's because I want to respect the time for your questions. So just quickly here, I know this is small, so maybe we can leave these up for later if people want to come up, but this represents the current sort of spate of threat actors that we see. In the top left is the one matter that I actually did not work on here on the screen. This was a case that was the first of its kind by the US Justice Department against 5 members of the People's Liberation Army of China for hacking to steal commercial trade secrets from private companies. So, you know, all developed nations have online programs for espionage, spying, and so forth, as President Obama and others have said before. But the U.S. line, in contrast to China, at least in the past, has been that we don't hack private companies to steal, say, drilling technology from U.S. Steel or something like that to give to a national champion company. And so that was an issue that came up in diplomatic engagement before President Xi's first visit to the White House. The middle top picture, you'll recognize the very scary flag of ISIS. One of the last cases I supervised in my final role as Deputy Assistant AG on the national security side were a hacker from Kosovo who hacked into websites to steal personal information of members of the U.S. military and the government. He had become a sympathizer of ISIS, and he provided it to Junaid Hussain, who was ISIS's top hacker at the time. Junaid went out and combined this with social media data on these people and photographs and put together 1,200 or so targeting packages and tweeted them out in the United States and said, you know, brothers and sisters, you don't need to come to Syria to fight or wherever. You don't need a visa. You can kill where you live. It's crowdsourced terrorism using hacked data. So it's a shift to operationalization of hacking, and not just for propaganda or recruitment. The anonymous mask, Guy Fawkes mask, you'll recognize my partner Jim Pastore, who was a prosecutor in New York for a number of years, put a big dent in their program by prosecuting their 2 top people at the time. They're starting to resurge now. But it's an example of a group that's ideologically motivated. The bottom left sort of scary skull picture is what the Sony employees saw on their screen when the North Koreans attacked. And on the right is one of the, if not the, most notorious criminal hackers in the world. He's a Russian, Yevgeny Bogachev, and he ran a global botnet, an army of infected computers around the world. He was responsible for some of the first large-scale ransomware called CryptoLocker. And those of us at the department ran a global operation 2013, 2014 to try to dismantle that. He was outed because he's not been arrestable, and the choice was made, as with the PLA people, to, quote, name and shame, which is a relatively new thing for our government to do, to out people, call them out, call out the governments that may be harboring them, call out the lack of rule of law and so forth as to victims in foreign countries. It is important, you'll see, to have a cat that matches your outfit. So if you've got the leopard print outfit, you need the designer leopard print cat, or vice versa works too. I can barely read this. So this is a little bit about how it's changed over my time from lone juvenile actors evolving into, on the criminal side, what's really organized crime. And so where we had success, to the extent you could say we did, as a Justice Department, was using the same tactics that my partner John Gleason did against John Gotti. He prosecuted Gotti twice, then became a federal judge after he was a prosecutor. The first time Gotti had the jury fixed, so then the juror was prosecuted. And the second time Gotti had his real trial in front of a neutral jury and was convicted. But it was undercover techniques that you would use against organized crime. And we have found that our ability to use those legally, and you have that, as I understand it, in Australia from the time working with our colleagues here, to be able to infiltrate these groups and earn your way up. And even more than in the physical world of John Gotti, in the virtual world that we have now, where a lot of the hackers don't even know the people on their own team except by nickname. I can tell you very few of the people that worked with Yevgeny Bogachev knew he was Slavic, the famous Russian hacker who had been a menace for about 10 years on the internet. But so undercover techniques have been huge. In places like Japan, where I find myself going frequently, this is a handicap for them. They can't do undercover operations. They're not allowed to sort of lie to get into a group. And I think it holds them back in that respect. People will make their own choices as to when the losses tip the balance in favor of changing one's policy. It certainly is not for me to say. I'm just saying what's worked for us. You see the top groups are beginning to pull things in-house. I skipped a step, which is that it's reached such a scale and magnitude that cottage industries and services have grown up around the hacking community. So there are people that will host you and not ask any questions and not keep any records, bulletproof hosters. There are people that are checkers who will check your stolen loot of data against their database to tell you what the balances are on the cards and how fresh they are or in the accounts. There are people who are called money mules who will be the dopes that are not the smart ones. They don't have an IQ even to the level of Rex Tillerson, let alone the president. And they will be the ones to get the cash out at the machines and stuff. So they have the most risk and surface area, but they're the dumb ones who don't know very much. And now the top groups are starting to integrate vertically. So they're becoming, Walmarts of fraud and crime. Here's a big change we've seen, destructive attacks. And for me, my team's focus is a lot of things, but my own personal focus on the team is preparing our clients for the storm of an incident. When you've lived through Sony and Target and all of these big incidents, you see patterns emerge about little things that made a big difference in the impact or risk. One of the examples here is the difference between Saudi Aramco in 2012, which was hit by the same sort of wiper that Sony got hit with some years later. Saudi Aramco lost its entire network, essentially, 35,000 or so systems. Sony lost systems and was down for several days, but was able to recover, and the difference was speed of action. The difference was somebody made a bold decision without calling a board meeting while the network was being wiped to shut off the global network, risking not knowing perhaps whether their job would be there on Monday morning if they were wrong. So we think about that as crisis planners. So I'm a lawyer, yes, but I feel like I'm more of a crisis management person than anything else, in that we want to try to front load these decisions. Destructive attacks, you want buying credit monitoring for your customers will not save you. If you're like Sony and your systems are down, your employees may not be able to card in at the gate, and then you've got to sit there with driver's licenses or IDs and invite people in. You don't have your calendars. You can't tell what's coming up on your work projects. So that's a different type of crisis planning for a new breed of cyber attack that's growing. It's becoming more powerful, too, as Internet of Things fueled things. Depending on your vintage, you can hark back to the Gremlins movie or Transformers or something more current, where your toaster oven rises up and attacks you because it has an Internet Protocol address. But the armies of bots that are able to be commandeered by the best hackers are now exponentially larger because of all of these unconnected, often without a lot of thought or care, connected devices that are not password protected except for a default password. How many of you have set the password on your refrigerator? I'm guessing if you're like me, none of you. So this is a new thing. WannaCry, of course, the ransomware that struck was a combination of older ransomware techniques with a worm-type virus that spread on an automated file-sharing way. So it echoed across the world, and this is what the screen showed. To be able to pay, you have to know your way around Bitcoin. So as a crisis planner for our clients, we know a guy or someone to call. We can execute transactions in Bitcoin if we have to. It's a last resort to pay. It's a bad sort of thing to have to do. Some people have had to do it. If you're a hospital and you're down, you may have no choice. I won't even begin to say how bad it's been on the data breach side, and you've just heard some of the statistics in Australia, but Equifax has been sort of the mother of all breaches for us in the US, where basically all of the adult population, or nearly half the overall population, has lost their national identity numbers, our social securities, and other things. For those of us like me who lost their entire classified background check in the Office of Personnel Management breach a couple of years ago, this was no big thing because we're already owned in terms of all the data that's part of your background check being out there. So we talked about Equifax. Critical infrastructure, we've had a really robust discussion about privacy in our country, particularly post-Snowden. That's been a healthy discussion for our country and others. But we haven't talked too much publicly about keeping the lights on, literally, for risks to critical infrastructure as cyber attacks threaten trading platforms, power grids, healthcare systems, and so forth. We've gotten a little taste of it through the ransomware, especially in some places around the world where people were not running current technology and old systems were running. I'm going to end here in a second, perhaps on this one. I have some slides specific to the media, and maybe if some of you want them, I can send them to you. But nation-state activities on the rise, more nations involved. It's not the usual group of sophisticated people. I will say that, you know, my humble observation has been that the best criminal groups rival many nations, rival perhaps all but a few nations in terms of their sophistication and long-term view. People will ask me, what's changed? And then we'll go to the Q&A. What's changed? I use the acronym, or the initials, not an acronym, SPP, scale, persistence, and purpose. Scale is now off the charts. Speed has always been there. I left speed out purposely because I don't think it's changed that much. Scale of things hitting at speed has really changed. Persistence, meaning people in your system for years that you don't know about, and we've handled a number of breaches this summer, one of which was a nation-state breach where they were in the system for over 2 years in a critical infrastructure sector. Very, very troubling. How do you manage that? How do you even communicate among your security team to handle that, to eradicate the threat once you're so permeated? So persistence, people devoting more resources to be in there longer for higher yield targets, either on the espionage side for governments or on the criminal side for the big, big payday, like the SWIFT attacks that we've seen, not just your credit cards and low-level things that are still important to us and still at risk, but the scale has changed. In purpose, I'm alluding there to ideological motives and destructive attacks. There are different reasons for the hacks. And even on the theft of data, we've seen people, like in the Yahoo breaches that have been reported, taking email account information. So that's not immediately monetizable. I mean, sure, you could sell some of it, but there's an interim step there. So people are doing longer-term goals, or they're fulfilling longer-term goals through their hacking activity. So I was going to walk you through some examples of the media as victim more, media as valuable assets, which you know about better than I do, but your sources and other things, let alone all your data. Media's gotten better at cyber reporting. We used to be able to sort of mail it in a little bit as the government by not blinding people with science intentionally, but by being a little opaque. And now, not so much. Certainly where I'm at in Washington, the journalists are super sophisticated on these issues, and they know where the bodies might be buried or should be buried. And the same is true of plaintiffs' attorneys and people bringing claims, and regulators. They're becoming more educated. They're finding the soft spots. It's causing our clients to have to really raise their game because the paydays are getting huge. Cases are getting into discovery through motions to dismiss. People are really upset about having the stack of credit monitoring letters. Now they want action. We're out of the shock and awe era of big breaches, and we're into the who's going to pay for this era. And people are losing their jobs, large payouts, and so forth. So the role of lawyers like me, just like the role of journalists in covering all of this intelligently, the role of lawyers has risen tremendously because we're finding many more legal moments in how you planned, how you documented things, how you wrote things up, how you interacted with the media, the FBI, the AFP, and others. So with that, I think I'll stop, and we'll proceed to the Q&A.
All right, thank you. Well, where do you start? That was a scary but great presentation, Luke. God, it's the way we live, isn't it? It's the way the world works these days. And I realise there may be some things you can't go into great detail about given your previous jobs, but it's my job to try and get you to go into as much detail as you can about those things. But I think for all of us here, one of the most memorable or prominent episodes of hacking involved the alleged attack by Russia on the DNC in the US election campaign. And I remember reading about it at the time and wondering just how would that work? Like if it was a state-sponsored thing, is it a huge, warehouse full of people lined up at computers, or is it a relatively small group that would be involved? How would an attack like that work?
So thank you. It's a good question. You didn't waste any time getting to sort of the sensitive spots.
No.
No, which is good. It's fine. So I, without getting into the investigation, which conveniently happened after I left, so I actually don't know anything on the inside about the investigation. My view of it is governments, whether Russia or others, have been using sort of soft power tools to influence change, including regime change around the world for decades. Now, this goes back as long as the Cold War and, all of the sort of great game techniques and things. And now there are more tools available to do that. And so when you talk about a situation like this, whoever did it, it's the selective release of information. I'm sure they may have had damaging information on other people or other candidate, but it was a selective release here designed really to hurt one side is what it appears. This is my personal opinion. But it struck a chord with me because when I was at the embassy in Moscow, President Putin was coming up on his re-election, and there were protests, pretty large protests in Petersburg and on Red Square in Moscow. And the Russian government was really furious and blaming the U.S. for fomenting this through soft power funding of NGOs and aid to these groups that were dissident groups. They were not wild about the use of social media in their market without a controlled way, and they've since focused on controlling it. They didn't really have control of it then. And so there was a lot of retaliation, in my view, after that. USAID, one of our global agencies that works on development around the world, was thrown out. Our DOJ program was terminated. There was a foreign agent registration law, very aggressive one, passed. There were anti-gay propaganda laws passed, and that may have nothing to do with an election, but it's just another way of controlling speech. And so whether it's the US or Russia, China, whoever, there are just now more tools, and governments have a choice. Will they be secure enough to allow the public discourse to sort it out and the populace to sort it out? And is the public even ready to do that, or will they try to control things?
Are you surprised by, I think in the example with the DNC and others, is on the flip side, there's the lack of attention to security by some pretty prominent people. I think Hillary's chief of staff, or the campaign manager at the time, was a former John Podesta. He's a very well-credentialed guy who you would think would pay attention to those things. It always seems for us who are in there trying to, protect our sources and that, people at those high levels seemingly are blissfully ignorant, or is it reckless? Does that surprise you?
We have a long way to go. I think we're in what I've described as almost the digital Darwinism era, where if you write in an email, you have to assume it could be out there. You have to assume that it can be exposed. All of us are vulnerable. The platforms that we're operating on were initially built to be open, and security has sort of come in later and been retrofitted in. But you know, it's a simple phishing email leads to access to your inbox, and it's happened at major companies, law firms, governments. So it could certainly happen to John Podesta, and it did. And then it's a question of what you've written in those emails. So we see it many times with law firms now as a big issue. Law firms are soft targets. Some of the banks and large corporations we represent have gotten sophisticated, but the lawyers have sort of been vendors supporting big M&A transactions, initial public offerings, sensitive litigation. So have judges and arbitrators been around the arena watching the participants in the battle, so to speak. Now they are the ones that are targeted. They're the weak links. And so we have to tell our teams, and they don't love to hear it, we cannot talk about this sensitive stuff. Keep it logistical in the emails. Keep it, here's when we're going to have the monitored conference call. Here's when we're going to meet in person to talk about the details. If we don't do that, in an era where it's so hard to control all of the risks into your communications, we will suffer the consequences.
Yeah, I think we in the media probably try and apply some of the same techniques and meeting face to face and things like that to protect the confidences of the people we're dealing with. And on that point, even at the highest level in Australia, I think the Prime Minister and some of his cabinet team are using messaging apps like Signal or WhatsApp or whatever to communicate to do that in a secure fashion, and also I think avoid freedom of information or right to information requests from journalists and things for their correspondence. And a number of us in this profession use those same methods now as well. How are we right in assuming that those forums or formats are safe?
Yeah, as long as there are people at the keyboard, there's always a risk. People thought the SWIFT banking system was sacrosanct because it had never been hacked before, but then they realized there are people with passwords. And so, you know, if you're using an app that's encrypted, it's encrypted between your device and the one you're communicating with. But if your device is infected and your keystrokes are recorded or logged through malware, they have access to the same encrypted tunnel that you do, but it is certainly improves the situation significantly. So when we do a data breach response for a company, and we have a situation where we think the attacker especially is still live in the system, some of these attackers have been known to follow the security changes and read the emails of the security team, make sure they're following the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer's communications, and adjust accordingly for some years. And so we move the communications in that case out of band to an encrypted off a cloud site, you know, an Outlook 365 or some Google account, and it's protected by encryption and protected by multi-factor authentication. So if you log in to read the latest about the security response, you'll get a text message to your, I'm gonna grab my water in a second. You'll get a text message to your phone to alert you, you know, that, you know, you put the code in and you're authenticated. Thank you.
So you get
Appreciate
the
that.
two-step verification sort of, like we get that with our Gmail at work and different things like that. If you want to log back in, you have to punch in the code that comes to your
That's
phone
right.
and things like that. We'll throw this open to the floor pretty soon because I'm certain there's a number of people here with some pretty pointy questions for Luke. One other just that came from your presentation, towards the end you mentioned that your firm had been working on a case involving a lurker for 2 years or so inside the infrastructure of critical infrastructure there. Can you tell us how that lurker or that foreign state was identified in the system?
So typically it's, if they're in there for that long, it's only purely by accident that you discover them because they've so embedded themselves and so hidden their tracks that it really is only by happenstance. And in that case, it was a vendor that alerted them to some strange activity in the system.
And then what happens after that's discovered? What sort of steps would you advise that agency in charge of that infrastructure go through to assure themselves that they haven't been massively compromised?
Great question. If they're doing it right, I won't speak to that specific one. If you've done it right, you've thought about this long before it's happened. And so you have a written incident response plan, but it's not enough to have a plan. I like to quote my favorite cybersecurity expert, the boxer Mike Tyson, who was a U.S. Heavyweight champion back in the day, and he was confronted by a journalist who said, "Your opponent says he has a plan to beat you," and no one had beaten Tyson, and he said, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the nose." You get punched in the nose by Mike Tyson, and you could pretty much kiss your plan goodbye. So you got to have a written plan. This is all pre-incident, pre-mess. And then we run people through what we call a tabletop or a simulated exercise. And it's not just technical, but it's all the people that would really make the decisions about media inquiries and FBI inquiries and what to share with regulators, when you have disclosure obligations, how long should we wait with these incomplete facts? It's really getting comfortable with incomplete facts. It's almost like training your body for a marathon or a century bike ride where there's a period where it's going to be kind of dark for you and ugly, but because you've mentally prepared and been through it, you're comfortable working your way through it. It's going to get better on the other side. And so if it's done right, all that's in place, and you're breaking glass and executing on your plan, it won't always be just like you practiced, but it'll be close. But then the question is, how do we isolate what's happened, find out how deep it's gone? We want to have our communications about it be out of the attacker's view, because if we start to make changes, they will see that and they will adjust their position accordingly, and it'll be even harder to get them out. So we try to plan things offline, so to speak, or in another place, and then we bring it all down at once. Whatever changes we're going to implement, we try to kick them out all in one shot. There's a real art to it. It's not just your software defenses or your antivirus. It's risk management. And this is where lawyers have come in. People will say to me in places like Japan, why lawyers? Why would we hire lawyers to do this kind of thing? And the answer is because we love suing each other in the US. Lawyers are the ones running these responses, or prosecutors like I was have been the ones running it. So we know this drill, we've seen this rodeo, and we can help cut through the noise and get to the right choices, for our clients.
Yeah. I'm going to throw this open to the floor now. Who would like to take the first shot? Anyone? Michael?
Thank you. Google and Facebook, what role are they playing here, both in the sort of soft power side of influencing that international governments, but also in the sort of cybersecurity versus openness debate? They are platforms that are absolutely crucial to most people's lives, and that we're on all the time. How do you assess the responsibility of what they're up to?
Just a great question. And this is a problem, as we were talking before we started, that's really inherent to democracies. And so I guess it's a good problem to have, that we have these amazing life-enriching technologies, and that we're democracies subject to, public discourse, and not autocratic societies that aren't. But it's nevertheless a problem, a good problem, but a problem. So, the companies that are in the lead, I think, are recognizing that, and they're trying to get to the answers. I'm not sure that anybody has a good answer. I'm here in large part in Australia for the International Bar Association big annual conference, which is in Sydney. I'm part of their cyber task force that they've newly formed. And we had a program yesterday on fake news. And I asked, what's the difference between the effect of fake news on the German election? All the same things were tried, but they seemed not to resonate. And on the US election, where many people believe it had a pretty profound impact. And to me, it was the level of our politicians' discourse had sunk to the gutter, such that we believe that aliens landed in Iowa, and we believe that Elvis lives in the Holland Tunnel in New York. I mean, if you used to laugh at those things, but the public discourse has reached such a low level, then you'll almost believe sort of anything, and people are very polarized as a result. So part of it is on the social media platforms to try to do better. And for Facebook, you know, they've really tried to come forward, and they've provided, at least the public reporting is, a lot of the material. They've been very forward-leaning about trying to figure out ways to vet and check facts. But to me, there's going to be no substitute for traditional journalistic ethics and professionalism. We need professional journalism now more than ever, because there's all this other information flying around. Every blogger is now a member of the media. We struggled with this in the Justice Department because we had special rules for searches of the media and legal process for media. Now everybody was claiming they were media because they had a blog about creme brulee or something. So we really need responsible, thoughtful, balanced journalism more than ever to balance all this crazy noise.
Sorry, another question over here. Oh, sorry, David.
There we go. Luke, David Polton. I realise this is a wide question, so apologies for that, but I wanted to ask about, from a legal point of view, the state of the criminal justice system and the way it responds to these kinds of issues, and what your thoughts are on its adequacy. We've found, certainly in our country, when we're trying to prosecute novel types of offences of transnational activity, and foreign bribery is a great example, but also cybercrime type issues where you might have the actor might be in your jurisdiction, but much of their activity has taken place outside. I just wonder what you think of the state of the justice system. Is it coping? Are there changes that could be made, reversal of burden of proof in some areas, that type of thing? Or are things okay? Are you able to effectively prosecute these matters?
Great question. I'll give you two sort of examples, one on a global scale and one on a very sort of local, close-to-home scale. I spent most of my career trying to make international operations work. So I would go to The Hague, to Europol, or the European Cybercrime Center, or JC3 in Japan, and we would try to break bread with other countries and get people on the same page to take down Silk Road or Game Over Zeus botnet or something. And the legal system, as bad as it is in any one of our countries, you can imagine all the disconnects when you cross borders. Capacity, even if the laws are semi-compatible, the capacity of the law enforcement varies, and the will to participate always varied. And each time I would go, though, and my colleagues would go, we would find there would be, say, 7 or 8 countries the first time that could do all of those things. They had the will, they had the laws, and they had the capability. And then there were others that said, wow, we really want to do this, but we just don't have that legal piece that lets us do this. So they were around the arena, and they came back the next time and they had changed it. And we made our own changes in some policies and laws. And so I think it's improving. There's a long way to go. I formed the Russian-American Law Enforcement Working Group to try to get US and Russia on the same page. Years of exchanging treaty requests through fax machines with piling up. Just antiquated, for something so fast-moving as you could be the world's slowest bank robber and not be caught, let alone a sophisticated cyber criminal like some of these. So that's one, is we need international commonality, at least among like-minded countries that aren't going to harbor hackers, that are trying to make it better. The other issue is in sentencing, for example, of all of the sort of people that were recruited into Anonymous. You saw the Guy Fawkes mask, this hacktivist group, ideological group. Something like Anonymous consists of 2% skilled, highly skilled hacker people and a whole bunch of stooges, a whole bunch of people that aren't that sophisticated that are told, this company's bad, here's a tool, download it and hit enter. And they all pound the company's website and cause tens of millions of dollars in damage. And the dumb ones tend to be the ones that are arrested, or at least they're part of the mix. And they come in front of a judge in our country. In our law, they're all equally liable for the whole loss. The company can't double recover, but the money can be taken out of any one of them. And the sentencing guidelines, more to the point, because they tend not to have money, put them off the charts. So are they going to go away for 10 years as a 19-year-old or a juvenile because they pushed enter late at night? You know, how do you deal with that? And so that's got an even longer way to come. A lot of these big cyber crimes are by juveniles, and you can throw a pencil at them is about it. There's in most countries, and so this is a challenge.
I think we've got another question from over here.
Yeah, hi, Kate in Brarity. I'd just be interested in your views on the sort of challenge that companies end up in when they have a breach in terms of when they disclose. So there seems to be a number of companies like Equifax are now being criticised for having taken a number of months to come out. There was a company in the UK, TalkTalk, who came out very quickly. Their CEO went on, I think, the BBC News at 10 o'clock one night to warn their customers. She was then roundly criticised for coming out, not having enough information, potentially scaremongering customers. I think with Target in the UK, that came out through a leak from the press, from information on the dark web. So it looked like Target were being secretive. Can you give us some sort of insights in terms of what goes on behind the scenes when people are making that decision about when to go public?
Fantastic question, and that's the sort of space that I live in at the core, is that storm and how to manage that. Increasingly, the choice is taken away from the company because it is the media noticing that their stuff is for sale on the dark web. Some of the media outlets, I believe, are hiring dark web monitoring, which is a good service. A lot of companies use that. They'll hire someone to keep an eye on the dark web for their name and their stuff, or maybe their valuable IP, and alert them that their material is for sale. But the media will see that too and be the ones that want to break the breach and call for comment. Oftentimes it's law enforcement that calls and says, we're seeing some connection from your servers, you know, to this place overseas that we know is associated with bad characters. Those are situations where the clock is already running immediately. The regulators in our jurisdiction and in Europe are taking the choice away as well. They're setting tighter and tighter tripwires that require them to be notified about smaller and smaller events or possibilities of events. Sometimes I wonder if the regulators have to set up 1-800 hotlines with the way they've set the limits, because they're going to get so many calls for every, some of them have said, tell us about every attempt. Well, I mean, that's millions if you're Citibank or someone. I mean, that's millions per hour probably. So the decision is usually, do we have enough of a nucleus of facts that we think that part's not going to change? We don't need to know everything, because if we wait for perfect, it's going to be too long. So we have to have good or something like that in terms of a core of facts. We have to be consistent in our message. We have to be customer-oriented and focused. This is me advising my clients. They may not always like what I say. They have their own culture. But my view is, if you're our client, you're paying us a lot, you're probably in this for the long game. People don't hire us who are like fly-by-nights. And so you better be customer-leaning, you better be public message-oriented, be honest and lean forward in your messaging. We've had situations where the media will call and they will say, we've noticed something, your database is supposedly for sale. And I saw one where the price seemed way wrong on the dark web. The price was way off, astronomically high. And I called the FBI, which is another increasing thing for lawyers that have my background, to be able to know who to call and what to ask. I said, this just doesn't seem right. You know, this doesn't look right. And they said, no, we have visibility on this person. He's what we call a ripper. He's a fraudster on the fraudsters. He really doesn't have that material. So he was threatening to blast it to 13 media outlets. So we called the journalist. I said, look, let me call her and say, I want to speak on background. And I called her and I said, look, we have a feeling, we have strong evidence that this is bogus, and law enforcement backs us up, and they're willing to have us say that to you. What I can tell you is, if we turn out to be wrong, which we don't think, we'll come to you first. You know, and she realized it was a fake and wanted to be a credible journalist and did not write something about it. So it's a way to sort of treat people with respect and answer the question, be as factual as you can. The window is getting shorter to hold on to things. In our law, there is a law enforcement safe harbor against notifying consumers. I can only assume this is why Equifax had 5 weeks or waited 5 weeks. Normally you don't have that kind of time unless you have this safe harbor. Our securities laws, however, as to the effect on investments, do not give this safe harbor, and that's another question. And so that's what our Securities and Exchange Commission has announced they're looking at Yahoo for, is why didn't you investigate this further? And they said, well, we only knew about 30 accounts in 2014. Now it's however many billion accounts. And they said, well, and the implication is you have a duty to investigate. It's not just what you know on the surface, but you have to look under the hood.
That's a pretty good point. We've got some students here from Kilvington Grammar who are regular attendees at our events, and I'm sure this will be a pretty good question.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick from Kilvington Grammar, and my question is, how does the threat to cybersecurity impact our vision of a cashless society?
It's a great question, Nick. Thank you. I think we're going to continue on our way to a cashless society, and probably we should, but it certainly makes it a little more challenging in a digital cryptocurrency world like Bitcoin to figure out what's behind it. If we assume that things will go the way of encryption, that Signal and other WhatsApp and other encrypted technologies will prevent law enforcement from getting in the string of communication like they've done for years, and we then take away the money trail largely, it gets harder to have clues into solving the crime. You can still find out, who's arranged the account if you have that level of visibility. You used to be able, until recently, to see them turn the cryptocurrency into real cash to use in the real world. But now, of course, as you probably know better than most of us, you can use the cryptocurrency like Bitcoin to just outright buy things, on Amazon or wherever. And so it's causing law enforcement and investigators to have to become much more modern and creative in their methods to solve the crimes.
Any more from the floor? Mark? Just while the microphone goes over there, you mentioned, Luke, in your talk before that some of the criminal organisations you've encountered are almost as sophisticated as nation states, bar a few that we can probably name. Where do they recruit from?
So another great question. Many of them are self-taught. I think there's been a fair amount of work. A friend of mine is a former BBC correspondent, Misha Glenny. And Misha did some research in a book called Dark Market, which was about an FBI operation that some of us worked on in Pittsburgh that made a lot of waves internationally. Had about 60 or so arrests internationally. And Misha went and studied people in Ukraine and parts of Russia who had been disenfranchised by the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was less the parents, many of whom had mathematical or computer science degrees, it was their kids, that went on to sort of strike out on career cyber hacking fraud endeavors. So a number of them have had trained parents or are self-taught. One of the worst hackers in our history that I prosecuted was a character named Iceman. And he was a kid from Idaho, and he wrote his first computer program when he was 11 or 12, and he was one of the sort of first computer nerds that we really had probably in that state, and he went on to be one of the top 3 or so most notorious cyber criminals in our history. So many of them are self-taught. I think if they reach a level of education, certainly in a country where there's opportunity, like Australia or the US, there's job offers just waiting for them. They don't have to worry and look over their shoulder when they're on that beach on the Black Sea or whatever. They're going to get plucked away by law enforcement. They can have a legitimate high pay. We can't keep them. In the FBI, we struggle to keep them. They're being offered so much money to go to the private sector. But in countries where people have been largely disenfranchised, it's harder. I noticed in Romania, since they've joined the EU and they've really modernized, that the cybercrime seems to have plummeted. They used to be so notorious, right up there with the Russians and Ukrainians. And now they seem to be much more proactive. You see companies like Bitdefender and others rise up, doing a great job in the country.
There we go. Mark?
I mean, clearly the growth of cybercrime is terrifying. It's exploding. What's the outlook? Are you pessimistic, optimistic? Do you feel, you know, the good guys can get on top over time?
I think I have to be optimistic. In a sort of smaller sense, as I've said to some folks here earlier, you're sort of paralyzed by the shock and all of the risks, and it seems almost futile to even try when you first start out in this area, especially as a prosecutor. I mean, these are other jurisdictions. We have a thread of evidence to hang on. It takes forever. The criminal's gone on to the next scheme. But you start making the arrests. You start bridging the gap. Our clients are starting to get better at blocking the attacks. Software is being written perhaps a little better, at least the ones that they're relying on. Testing is happening. People are doing incident response plannings. What we're seeing is almost like the schemes are trickling down the food chain. Like the top targets, I mentioned Citibank or Bank of America or whoever it is, those are now pretty darn hard targets. They face the highest volume of attacks, but they're pretty tough. You got to be really good to get in there. So they're moving to the next level of institutions, to the mid and smaller sized businesses. And some of these botnets like Game Over Zeus that the guy with the cat ran really decimated small businesses. And they didn't have the insurance to put the money back. So for many of them, it was an existential event to have a $7 million wire go out overseas. So it's coming down the food chain, forcing all of us to raise our game. I think we need to be like the airline industry, which decided long ago not to compete on safety, that it's bad for everyone when a plane falls out of the sky. So we need, as an industry, to share the latest safety information, make it safer for everyone. So we urge our clients not to be lone rangers, but to integrate into sharing groups and networks. And this has been a big push in the US and a few other places to make the world a smaller place. So the criminal scheme is maybe only effective once against the first victim and not against the whole sector.
Guys, we've got to wrap up pretty soon. Got time for one last question from the floor.
It's a slightly personal question, Luke, but hopefully it will offer some advice for all of us as Mr. Cybersecurity. How often do you change your personal passwords?
Well, I live and die on my law firm's network, and like a few law firms, we always run scared. There has to be tremendous humility. One of the major firms, DLA Piper, had a really huge incident, and they were down for several days, and I heard, not from our firm, but some gloating by others, and it just wasn't in my nature to do that, or my colleagues, because we just know how this can happen to any one of us. And so we've invested as a firm in rapid password changes, a lot of layered defenses, you know, staying vigilant and so forth, segmenting things so your eggs literally are not in one basket. One of the things that I did, I don't know if this is right, but to be very personal about it, and we moved to Russia, and we were some of the last people besides our Amish neighbors in Pennsylvania to move to online banking, is we said, you know what, let's buy a second laptop for just a couple $100, a cheap one, that doesn't surf, doesn't have gaming, doesn't have apps, our kids don't touch it, it just whitelists to our banking site and 1 or 2 credit cards. And we just keep it up to date. And this has been our system. So we have a computer that can be messed with. We're going to buy a concert ticket or something like that. We do it on that other computer because we have protection through the credit card, but we keep our personal financial communications in a special channel. And nobody told me this. We just decided to do it. And it's kind of how we've lived, is we completely like log out of that and log into this.
Thank you.
Guys, that's a good way to wrap up, actually, because it's something we can all take away and do. So go out and get a cheap second computer and be disciplined. You got shares in any computer companies? I reckon I personally could sit here and ask questions all afternoon. So, but I know everyone's busy and Luke's very busy here. It's been a great topic. a great presentation on perhaps the biggest issue we as individuals, but also as countries face in this connected world. So it'd be great if everyone could put their hands together and thank Luke.